Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October the 14th Budget and Finance Committee meeting for the City of Franklin. We'll begin with a call to order, and we'll do that with a roll call vote. Alderman Peterson.
Here.
Alderman Shore.
Here.
And the chair is here, and I'll note that Alderman Speedy is absent. Let's go to item 1, which is consideration of approval of minutes of the September the 9th, 2021 Budget and Finance Committee meeting. I entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Proper motion and a second. Let's do a roll call vote. Alderman Peterson, how do you vote?
Yes.
Alderman Shore, how do you vote?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes on that. Let's go to item 2, which is consideration of draft resolution 2021-159, a resolution to amend the organizational chart of the Building and Neighborhood Services Department. Michael.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the Finance Committee. My name is Michael Walters-Young, Budget Strategic Innovation Manager. This item should take all of about 20 seconds. Resolution 2021-159, again, we're trying to learn from Tuesday night. Resolution 2021-159 is a resolution to make the most minor of all changes to the organization chart of the Building and Neighborhood Services Department. As you can see on the screen and in your packets, the current organization chart has 3 zoning enforcement planner positions and 3 plans examiner 1 and 2 positions. The proposed change is to make 4 plans examiner 1 and 2 positions and 2 zoning enforcement planner positions. They're both grade F in the starting level, so therefore there is no monetary change. We seek your request to recommend approval to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen.
Any questions of Michael or anyone else? Then I will entertain a motion to approve.
Longer than 30 seconds.
I know we did, but we're gonna let that go. That was the mayor's 30-second that he was in on.
I'll move approval.
Second.
And that motion is to approve and to send to the full board. Alderman Peterson, that is the proper motion in a second. Alderman Peterson, how do you vote?
Yes.
Alderman Shore, how do you vote?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes on that. Let's go to item 3 then. Update on the city's non-pension related investments. Christine?
I will start, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman, but I do have special guests to recognize for this item. And for folks who have followed this committee, the fall is when we believe is a good time to do an annual update of the city's investments, non-pension related investments. We typically focus on our investments as of June 30th because, of course, that's the end of our fiscal year. We are working on our audit right now, so it's certainly in mind. So this presentation will focus primarily on June 30th and give you some comparison information as well as the investment outlook for the types of investments that cities are allowed to invest in. I will give just a little bit of introductory information as well that here at the City of Franklin, there's a team of 3 of us who manage the city's non-pension related investments. It certainly is part of what we do in scope, but we do have a team approach. I want to thank Mike Lowe, our comptroller, who's sitting across the room from me. Lori Pope is with us. She's our financial analyst. If she will wave so the committee can see Lori. She does a lot of work making these transactions happen and be posted, and the 3 of us to work very closely together on a weekly basis, sometimes a daily basis on the investment management. The city, as of June 30th, had close to $200 million under in non-pension related investments. We had $180 million that was in city funds, including utilities. And then we also had about $14 million of bond proceeds from the 2019 bond issue, general obligation bond issue. And then, of course, this fall we did close a water and sewer bond issue with had proceeds of $13 million, which are not reflective in that amount. So it's as cash is always fluid, that dollar amount can change, but that does give the scope of the city's investments, and it is significant. We do follow there's 3 different categories of what we as your team are always working to do. We certainly have a investment policy which the board approves, and from time to time we request the board to update. The last time the investment policy came, we asked the board to allow us to invest up to 30% of the city's funds in the state local government investment pool, the LGIP program. We needed a place to be able to put our investments where we could pull that back in quickly because we had run out of capacity with our banking contract that we were under. We also have state law restrictions on what local governments are allowed to invest in, and sometimes many people aren't aware just how restrictive those requirements are. And so we do have state law restrictions as well as best practices that we are always wanting to learn and strive what to do best in managing our funds. But what's also very important is we do have investment advisors who are assisting us. All of our transactions are approved by city staff. Mike Lowe and I approve all of the investment purchases that are made, but we do have professional guidance for that, for the management of our investments. And we have, for that, we have government portfolio advisors. And we're very happy today to have Dave Westcott as well as Garrett Cudahy and with us. And they also have a team approach to serving the city. I was looking at their website and looking at faces, and while they are located in Oregon, I routinely work with, I believe, 6 people on your team who serve the city of Franklin that are available to us at any time with questions or guidance for us. And so they certainly approach the city of Franklin as a team, and we are very fortunate that these 2 gentlemen were willing to come and be with us today, but they do have a strong bench of who serves the city of Franklin. And Dave Westcott has been here before. He was here 2 years ago to be with this committee. He is a co-founder of GPA and has served in investing the public funds for over 40 years now. And so Dave has worked on our account for several years now. And Garrett is relatively new to serving at GPA, even though he has been in the profession for many years as well. And he is now serving on the city's account. And this is his first trip to the city of Franklin. So we got to spend a good part of today showing him the city of Franklin and downtown. So I will hand over to Dave, and he will be bringing in Garrett to give this update and presentation to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. She did mention 40 years, and unfortunately, I've had a long tenure, or fortunately, I've had a long tenure in this business, and I was just thinking about the uncertainty of the times that we live in now, given the pandemic, and we're 20 months into that pandemic now, and I mean, I think back to the markets that I've seen, from the high inflationary, high interest rate markets of the late 70s, early 80s, to the tech crash that occurred in 2000, to the 2008 crash that caused by overvaluations of real estate in 2008, 2009. But I've never had or thought I would have the opportunity to live through a worldwide pandemic that impacts our financial markets the way they have. Extremely uncertain environment going into the pandemic, uncertain environment going out of the pandemic, and as we speak to you today, an uncertain environment where we're going to go from here. So much of it is dependent upon inflation and the direction that inflation is going to take, and how the Fed will respond to that. Garrett's going to speak to that here in a minute about the markets and the impact of the Fed and what we think that the Fed, their perspective is of the pandemic. But the bottom line is that we've gone 20 months now, and I want to tell you that the city finances and the city's portfolio has come through exceedingly well. The only damage being, and I'll show you this as we get into the slides, is that our interest income has declined because of the Fed's posture to move interest rates to zero as a result of combating the impact of the pandemic 20 months ago. But even with that, you'll see that your interest rate that you're still earning is substantially above current market rates, and so you're surviving well here so far today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Garrett, and he can talk a little bit about the markets, and then I'll get back in and talking about the portfolio and how we ended up the fiscal year 2021.
Well, excellent. Well, good afternoon, Chair Barnhill and members of the committee, and thank you for having us, and importantly, thank you for the partnership. And we love working with the city here, and we take the task very seriously. So thanks for having us today. And we're going to talk about the markets, and as Dave mentioned, these are wild times, as I'm sure you guys are well aware. But we want to make this interactive and helpful for you, so please interject whenever and however often with questions or comments that you have as we go through the journey here. Could we advance, I think, one more slide? One more, please. There we are. This is a pretty messy slide, but the main theme here is we're confused. Everyone's confused, and the Fed's not immune to that either. And we have to start by talking about the Federal Reserve because so much of your investments are influenced almost virtually by what the Fed policy does, right? Most of your money is either in a liquidity product that's virtually directly tied to the federal funds rate, or in investments 3 years and in, which is heavily influenced by the federal funds rate. So unfortunately or fortunately, they, depending on the direction, they control the outcome of where your interest earnings will go. What's really happened over the past few months is, not a shock. What we could broadly say is the employment markets have healed, but not as quick as we thought. Inflation has risen like we thought, but much more than we had anticipated. And growth expectations have underperformed and continue to kind of be gradually revised down. Still in positive territory, but all that puts the Fed in a very challenging light, especially given roughly 1 year ago, the Fed tried to change and pivot their, what we call the reaction function. They said, we're no longer going to try to preempt inflation. We're going to wait till it happens, and then we'll step on it. And we're going to favor labor markets more than we favor the inflation outcome. Well, again, exceedingly high inflation that's been messy, to say the least, and we'll talk in detail about that in a few slides, and labor markets that are stubborn to come along makes it very challenging. And really, I think the main takeaway from this is two things. There's a lot of division amongst the Fed members, and if you look at the slide, that is the yellow dots. We call this in our industry the dot plot. Every voting Fed member has a dot there that says, where do we think policy rates are going to go? Where's my vote on when and how far to raise interest rates? And as we've moved through time, two things have happened. The dispersion from the high and the low has widened dramatically, and also the time of raising rates has crept forward, which is challenging, right? The labor markets have been slow to heal, yet the Fed is saying we're closer to rate hikes. And the market and the Fed now anticipate raising rates in the back half of 2022, which if all goes well, that'd be a good thing for the city. We'd rather start investing in higher yields. But the market's starting to price that in today. If we go to the next slide, please. This is how markets have reacted to that change. And it's a little counterintuitive at first, and that is that front-end yields have gone up while long-term yields have gone down. And the real easy way to explain that, or the simple way of explaining that, is a Fed that goes sooner has to go less far in their journey to snuff out the inflation or the growth. If you don't let it get too out of control, much like a fire, you need less water to put the entire fire out. And that's how markets have been reacting thus far, leading 10 and 30-year yields quite a bit lower than actually where we ended the first quarter of the year. But 2-year and 3-year yields are starting to move up. And we anticipate that's a trend that'll continue as the economy continues and we get closer to that eventual Fed liftoff, whether that's a 2022 or 2023 event. Nevertheless, the front-end rates, 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, will start to creep up and flatten out that interest rate curve. Again, as this happens, this will be beneficial to your portfolio as we keep laddering out kind of securities back in that 2-3-year range at higher yields. That's what we anticipate today. Of course, a lot can change in the next 12 months in particular as we get into that Fed hike, whether the economy behaves, whether inflation cools or stays hot. That will dictate the path and the pace of what the Fed will do. Next slide, please. This is the biggest story. This is the biggest, as I like to say, the known risk in the market is inflation. And I'll start by kind of laying the backdrop of what in the world's going on. And it really can be characterized by two things. Almost all the inflation thus far has been in what we call the goods part of the economy. There's the goods and the services side of the economy. Services much larger, about 70% of our growth. Almost all of it's been through the goods channel. And really why that is we did something unique this time around where we had what we call a demand side response to a supply side problem. It wasn't that demand really cooled, it's that we shut the economy down and supply chains were damaged, right? That constrained, if people get sick in factories, they have to shut it down. Well, what we did is we reacted with a demand side policy response. We said, holy cow, the economy's cratering, we better get money out there right now. Well, that kind of put a double whammy on that. If you have less goods being able to be produced, but more money chasing those goods, guess what you're going to get? You're going to get inflation. And we've seen it notably in automobiles. In fact, headline inflation is over 5% today. If you took just new and used car prices and rental car prices out, it'd be about 2.5%. That's a completely different dynamic. So we really have two things going on. One is we measure inflation generally year over year. Roughly this time last year, prices were very depressed, especially in leisure, hospitality, airfares, hotels, et cetera. So we have what we call the base effects. Measuring the price change from 1 year ago leads to an outsized gain. And two, we're just seeing those anything that has to do with semiconductors or uses a chip in it is increasingly hard to come by and expensive. And we all, I think, see the headlines about all the boats parked outside of the ports of Los Angeles. These are real issues. And a lot of it has to do, again, with that demand side response to the supply side problem. And a good illustration of that is retail sales in America. Believe it or not, we went through a recession where at one point 20 million Americans were unemployed. But we have retail sales that are 22% higher today than pre-COVID. And then that is all to do with more money into consumers' pockets from stimulus, while the services economy, which is the much more flexible and larger side of the economy, was shut down, forcing people that wanted to engage the economy into the goods sector.
So, can I ask you a question? And I've been following a little bit the issue with the parked boats, ships, I guess I'm supposed to say, in Los Angeles. But the number that I think that I heard them say, and I'm guessing, but was like there's 78 or 80 parked. That seems insignificant, quite frankly, to the world shipping area, and why that particular, and so I'm thinking people are blowing smoke up our you-know-whats, saying that correcting that or having the Port of Los Angeles run 24 hours a day instead of 12 is going to make a difference in the supply chain. And not only that, we've got also lots of issues with regard to just getting it from off the boat, once it's off the boat, getting it in our hands. And so I don't see that changing real quickly. And that gives me a lot of concern. But on the other hand, it also may have a big impact once it gets out there in that it may reduce inflation, because something may happen. We may have all sorts of this stuff gets to the end product, then all of a sudden we have a difference in supply and demand. And I don't know what, I just was thinking, you know more about this than I do, but it is confusing, and there's really, to me, well, first of all, we can't solve that problem by having a meeting in the White House yesterday. I mean, it just didn't get solved that way. Though I think that's probably fine, so people are bringing it to attention. But it's a long-term issue. Warehouses, truckers, delivery from the different places. It's across the board, not just 78 boats parked in Los Angeles Harbor.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. I mean, even if you solve it, you still have constant demand coming through. I mean, I hate to say it, but the only way to really solve the issue is to quell demand, right? And that tends to be, in our parlance, the term that the cure for high prices is often high prices, because either it induces supply or kills off demand. And I think we're starting to see early signs of the latter, and that is consumer sentiment, especially for large ticket items, has never been worse, right? When you pull consumers, like the University of Michigan sentiment, which has been around for decades, very reliable and pretty well tied to future growth expectations and consumption, is showing that people are balking at housing prices, large durable tickets, autos, because of price sensitivity. So unfortunately, I think that's the only way that you do get out of it, because you clear the backlog today, but if you keep stimulus out there and you keep doing these things, well, you're just going to have to run faster and faster. And we'll touch on it in a second, but you're right on the labor economy is also quite challenging. And to put it in perspective, we put $5.8 trillion of stimulus in the last 18 months into a $23 trillion economy. By far the largest impulse of money as a percent of GDP throughout the rest of the world. And unsurprisingly, we have the highest inflation. I mean, China's inflation is around 1%. It's a multi-decade lows. We are somewhat unique in this. Europe is a little troubled because of the energy situation, but that's a little bit of an outlier. But really, I think it's getting the labor story fixed, because you're right. You get it off the boat, there's a truck shortage. Right? How are you gonna cure that? And you're right. You're just gonna move one problem down in the link of problems. So and also with growth in after the stimulus and the reopening. Well, Q2 was disappointing. We all thought at one point we'd have 10% GDP on an annualized basis for the quarter. Came out at 6.5%. That's still the highest quarter growth any of us alive have seen. right? So there is just a lot of pressure on these supply chains and manufacturing processes because we spent the last 30 years all getting fancy MBA degrees and tweaking logistics to be just in time and lean because that was all cost savings. But it caused a lot of fragility we now see. They're running it just in time in these multi-country cross-border supply chains. Yeah, it took a light breeze to knock a lot of those over and create these. So it will take time to repair them. Clearing the boats, you're right, is not a cure-all. That won't just fix it and make everyone have a good Christmas.
And inflation, to some degree, I think, is cyclical. I mean, we've spread it out for a long time.
Right.
I mean, lots of us remember, I was in the mortgage business when interest rates were 18%. I about went broke, I can tell you, because you don't lend much money at 18%. But, we've really gotten accustomed to a short-term, 2% inflation, if that, and only on certain products, and everything staying the same. Some deflation and a lot of technology, and so it's interesting that I don't know if we're correcting, and in some degree correcting, and we're seeing such a huge shift also. And I'm sorry, this is real fascinating to me, but we're seeing such a huge shift in weird employment. I mean, where we got still a high number of unemployed people, but yet we've got a huge, like the largest number of jobs being posted in the history of this country. And I want to say, well, why don't you all go to work? I mean, there's jobs there, and that doesn't make any sense either. And so I think we're in for a total different dynamic in how people work and where they work and what they do when they work, and that there may be sectors that just nobody wants to go to anymore. And that will have a big impact on like maybe people won't work in restaurants anymore, and maybe they're looking for other things. I don't know, but that's just an old man's thoughts.
No, I mean, I think you're spot
So
on.
if you've been in business 40 years, I'm no older than you are. I can tell you that. Maybe a little, but not much.
I remember those 18% times.
Yeah, but you weren't making a living trying to make.
My first mortgage was 11 3/4.
Isn't that great?
It was less than 18.
And the only thing that had my dad was so happy. He said, "Son," he said, "I know this is hurting you, but it's sure making me happy." Because he was investing in long-term bonds, like 12 or 13%.
Well, the irony of this, and I don't have this slide, I did it for another presentation, but we talk about the house price surge, which that's true, but you've been in the mortgage business, you understand this. Believe it or not, if you take the median household income, the median home price, and you assume you finance with a 10 or 20% down payment, it's almost the most affordable time to finance at home
Absolutely.
today. Because in the 70s, that would have been 40% of your income. Today, it's about 29%.
That's exactly right.
So my point too with this is I think inflation will cool. I don't know that it'll fully come back to the 2% next year or the year after, but it's not going to live at these levels. This is stifling.
Yeah.
We can't handle it. And if I'm wrong on that, is the biggest problem, because this entire economy, whether it's housing, stock market, or anything that you put a valuation on, even Bitcoin, can't sustain meaningfully higher long-term interest rates because we rely on financing things. The problem with COVID was that we added fragility in order to get over the recession, right? We added a gigantic debt stock around the world. There's some $300 trillion worth of debt around the world today. It surged about 20% in the last 12 months.
Yeah, but look what you can get it for. I mean, why not? I'm in the real estate business. I refinanced everything I owned, commercial, in the last 2 years, based upon 10-year Treasury rates dropping and dropping and dropping. Made all the difference in the world. And but that's not can't last forever. I don't think.
But my point is just that if inflation does take hold and the Fed's tools for curing it will be very blunt and painful, right? Because of that dynamic of higher interest rates will damage the underlying trends.
I'm ready for them, so I'm fixed, so everything's good. I got a 30-year fixed mortgage, and I'm sorry, I will shut up.
Go ahead.
No,
So the 4.1%, that's the inflation rate now, when I go back to the chart before this right here, is that? So
The inflation rate today, if you're looking at CPI, headline CPI is in the mid-5s. And core CPI is in the low mid-4s. I will say, importantly, though, the month-over-month changes, right? The rate of change is declining. That's good. That's 0.2, 0.4%. So if you kind of annualize that forward, it shows a much cooler path. But it is going to rely on a lot of these supply chain issues to get resolved. Frankly, semiconductors, if we didn't have the semiconductor hiccup, as I kind of mentioned, inflation ex autos is 2.5. Nobody's crying about that, right? We could easily lean into solving labor market problems and not be worrying about inflation if that was the dynamic, but that's just not.
Are the gas prices, are they tied in?
They're tied into headline CPI, but not core.
Okay.
Core cuts out food and energy because they tend to be volatile. I know it's not really helpful to people that eat and go places, but it's what policymakers like to do.
You know, when John said something about his dad, I won't necessarily tell you what my dad thought of the president at that time. But since he wasn't seeking a job, he didn't care if it was unemployment was 10%. And since he didn't buy a lot, he didn't care if inflation was 10%. But he sure did like that interest rate.
Didn't he? That's exactly right.
Because if he had any to invest, it was making him 10, 12%, whatever. Well, more than that, I guess, at the time. So he was always delighted for those three things. Two didn't bother him at all, and one he was enjoying. So
If we can move to the next slide, because I think the labor market, one quick statistic that just came out was speaking about people working in the odd dynamics are massive, but one statistic came out in August of this year, 2.9% of the labor force quit their job. That's a record high. We have almost 158 million people employed. 3% of them chose to walk out. Most of them found a new job, but that just goes to show the turnover, the volatility, and that hurts productivity because whether you're skilled or not, going into a new organization, there's tricks you have to learn.
Sure.
So that is definitely causing some problems. But the number one problem, and if I were a policymaker, if I were the president, I'd be less worried about boats and more worried about childcare in schools. Because we are seeing what was a huge tailwind for the heady growth of the 70s, 80s, 90s was, frankly, women entering the workforce in America. That was the biggest tailwind we've had. You just have more productive people doing more things, right? And the economy is nothing more than people doing things for each other. The more of that, the better, the more dynamic. Well, they are falling out rapidly. The working age female labor force participation rate keeps falling. And I get it. I have 2 small kids. We can hardly keep them in school. Our daycare shut down. It's not going to reopen. There's just capacity gone because, well, those people can work at Walmart for $20 an hour, Amazon for $25 an hour with benefits. The child care system can't sustain those wages because it's just a disincentive for the person to work. They'd rather stay at home. It's uneconomical to work and pay those type of wages. So that's a real problem. I think that's the number one issue today. But looking at the labor market healing, I thought we would have recovered labor much faster this summer. Dave and I were talking. We were going into the summer expecting double-digit growth for Q2, and we thought, man, we might have a few months of million-plus job gains per month.
Don't you think that was the spike, though, in COVID? I mean, that was the Delta variant just taking hold of this country again, and I don't think anybody expected that to happen. And so,
But the last was, they were expecting, what, 500,000, and it turned out to be 299,000?
Yeah, and I would say August, because when you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistic monthly reports, they kind of cut off mid-month. So when you see the September jobs report, it was really August 15th through September 15th. Yeah. So I kind of throw some cold water on Delta being the primary driver of it, because the August report, which was July to mid-August, was actually weaker than the one we just got in many respects, not in the headline number, but in the details. And that didn't have Delta fingerprints on it. That was not a time period where Delta was taking hold. So these dynamics are really bizarre. But today we still have 5 million people less employed right now than pre-COVID. They're predominantly in the leisure, hospitality, and services sector. No shocker there. But if you look at trend employment, if it were to keep up with the population growth, we're probably about 8.5 million jobs below where we need to be. So while the unemployment rate has gone down, it's gone down for the wrong reasons, and that's people choosing to exit the labor force voluntarily. That's not good, right? And this is something that if inflation cools back to 2-3% next year and doesn't look very dangerous for the forecast, I think you could see the markets push back Fed hikes, because I think the Fed looks at recovering. They want to recover a lot of this participation and get people back in the labor market. I think it's just going to take longer. I mean, GDP has fully recovered, but the labor market has not. That's not something anybody in D.C., whether you're in Congress or in the Eccles building where the Fed resides, they're not happy with that. So inflation's the thing that'll kill them, and it'll be a painful outcome to snuff out.
Well, what you saw here when you were going around Franklin, every store, every shop, every whatever has we are hiring.
That's right.
Is that typical in what you in the areas in which you go to and see? Is that?
It is. It is, and I think a lot of it also has to do with what we just talked about with growth. No one alive has seen a quarter of growth that fast. So the reaction was, holy cow, I need to staff up. I hope that those job openings continue. They did decline pretty rapidly last month. We lost 700,000, but there's still almost 10 million open jobs in America today. But yeah, they're not being filled at the pace that we thought they would. And also one thing too that's very interesting is the enhanced unemployment benefits. There's been no statistical relationship showing those states that ended it early, or frankly ending them earlier this month, led to a different outcome. For some reason or another, people are choosing a different lifestyle, choosing something else, doing whatever it is they do, but that has not been an incentive to get back to the labor force. So that's why I'm leaning on schools and daycare at this point, because if that doesn't fix it, I'm not sure what is. It's not a healthy labor market if those aren't the fixes. So I'll just end here. I know we've taken up a little bit of time. If you can go one more slide. I will just say that, again, we've had a lot of inflation, a little bit of underwhelming growth. I think the peak in both growth and inflation are behind us. I hope to see these wind down, but certainly the uncertainty around inflation is the biggest thing. If that doesn't get itself under control and the Fed needs to do something, I don't think that's going to be a fun process for anybody. It'll help your interest income, but I think it'll be painful elsewhere. Also, we have a lot of issues around the politics, right, with the debt ceiling coming up. That kind of jumped up and got us here a little bit in October. The can's been kicked down the road. And we also see members in DC kind of balking at the infrastructure package, which we thought would help the economy in the long run. And obviously, we're running into midterm elections next year. The Fed's usually not fond of raising rates in the middle of elections, so that might play in as well. But I think a lot of uncertainty ahead, and we really need to get through these 12 months and see what is the underlying strength of the economy. Sans $5.8 trillion of stimulus being handed out every quarter. Where is the consumer? Where does inflation moderate or level out to? And that'll be the big driver of, is the Fed in play, or is this going to get kicked down the can as well? So with that, I'll turn over to Dave on the portfolio, unless you guys have any other questions.
Thank you very much. Very informative.
I think the bottom line to all of that is that interest rates are low currently. 1-year Treasury bills around, 10 basis points, somewhere in that area. 2-year Treasury notes are around 28 basis points. So, we're extremely negative to any inflation rate that you can possibly imagine, and we will probably maintain that negativity for the foreseeable future. There should be a closure, though, somewhat between the existing rates that we have now and the inflation level. I feel just naturally that we should see interest rates rise gradually on the front end, but the Fed controls that through their Fed fund mechanism. And so even though the markets see that, people maybe with some sort of common sense see that, it probably isn't going to occur until the Fed capitulates and makes a move toward higher interest rates. And that at least is 6 months away, if not 12 months, and if not longer. So it's going to be a slow process. We do think that the rates will slowly rise, but there's all sorts of caveats out there in terms of headwinds to the economy next year, in terms of a fiscal cliff, in terms of the political environment. Once again, back to the beginning of what I said, is that we're just in an extremely uncertain time period here, and it's going to be a very difficult time to monitor and manage through. Turning to the first slide here in the overview, I want to show you the portfolio as it existed at the end of the fiscal year. We had at that time about $60 million in cash or short-term cash equivalents, and $129 million in the investment portfolio, longer invested securities. The book yield on the portfolio was 91 basis points on June 30. Once again, to give you some context in that's in an environment with an 8 or 9 basis point 1-year Treasury bill and 2 and 3 basis points for Treasury bills in the short end. The market yield, if you took all those securities and bought them today at market, would only yield you 19 basis points. So you can see we locked in these yields at substantially higher levels than what are currently existing in the market today. And the duration on these securities is just a little under 1 year, meaning your average maturity on these is less than 12 months, so a very short duration. And the average credit rating is all AAA securities because you own treasuries and agencies of the governments in the portfolio, and all of those are rated AAA, at least by Moody's, not by Standard & Poor's, which will continues to rate our debt at AA+. The portfolio is divided down into four parts. We have the investment core, the liquidity, and then we segregated your bond investment, your 2019 bond investment, into a separate portfolio, and then a very small residual in a certificate of deposit. The core portfolio has a yield of 111 versus 91 of the overall portfolio. Your liquidity portfolio is yielding 43 basis points, which is probably the highest liquidity portfolio of any portfolio that we manage in the country. So you're very fortunate there that you have a contractual relationship with a local bank here that is paying you 1%, and that contract runs out, I believe, in June of next year. So that will hold up your liquidity results very well until that contract terminates. And then your bond fund investments are currently yielding 167 for your bond fund, which I believe you only have about $9 million. Well, as of June, you had $9 million in that portfolio, and those were originally purchased at a yield of a 185. So all in all, the yields are substantially higher than the market yields as existing on June 30th. And later on here, I'm going to show you how they look today, just 3 months after June 30. Next slide, please. So this is the asset allocation change, and this is quarter over quarter. So all I'm looking at is just how it changed between June 30th and September 30th. The top line there, U.S. Treasury securities, we increased the Treasury portfolio holdings by 8% and decreased the agency securities by 5%, which is a little counterintuitive. Usually agencies yield more than Treasury, so we try to carry a little higher balance in agencies. But this is an unusual time again, and agencies today are in such short supply and high demand that their yield is virtually on top of Treasuries. And so there's no yield advantage by going into agencies, and agencies don't have quite the liquidity or the security of a Treasury. So with all things being equal, we invest in the Treasuries as opposed to the agencies if the yields are on top of each other. So that's the reasoning there for the increase of Treasuries and the decrease of agencies. And everything else has pretty much stayed the same. We did, subsequent to the end of the year, we did increase your pool and bank balances primarily because of uncertainty and raising the liquidity up a little bit. Next slide, please. This is your fund balances. You're pretty consistent throughout the year. This goes back to June 20th, and you had $178 million of your total aggregate investment balances. And ended the year on June 30th of 21 at 190 million. So you had a little bit of growth. You guys, and we'll see this in a slide here, a couple down, is that your low points usually seem to be toward the end of the year in December, and your high points are typically toward your end of your fiscal year. And we've got a slide here that will review those balances. The book yield, I just want to point out the one column here that has book yield. We can see that back in June of 2020, the portfolio was yielding a 186, and today it's 91 basis points. So this is the impact of the Fed's policy of keeping rates at zero. As your securities mature and we reinvest them, we're reinvesting them at current market rates, which is those rates I talked about where they're anywhere from 2 to 10 basis points in the first year, and then out to about 28 basis points in the second year, and out to about 44 basis points in year 3. So that's our investing environment. It's all below your current book yield. So every time we have a maturity and we have to reinvest that, or we add cash into the core portfolio, that book yield adjusts yourself down a little bit. But it is still holding up well compared to your alternatives if you didn't have this core portfolio. And so that's working out very well for the portfolio. Next slide, please. So the true value of managing a portfolio such as yours, well, let me start off by saying, first of all, the primary objective is to make sure we've got liquidity to pay the bills. Okay, that's the first objective of the portfolio. So we want to maintain a certain amount of liquidity in order to make sure that we can pay the upcoming bills for that month. But once we exceed a certain amount of liquidity has a cost because the yields are less than your longer investments. And so if we over liquefy a portfolio, you're paying extra insurance, you're getting a reduced benefit in terms of lesser interest relative to keeping money in the core. So to optimize the returns on your portfolio, we want to make sure that we've got the right amount of money in liquidity and the right amount of money in the core. And this process here, looking at your past balances, is how we kind of come up with that number. You've had tremendous growth in the last 5 years. You've almost doubled the size of your investable funds from somewhere around $80 million in fiscal year 2017 up to about $150 million today. So you've had nice growth in there. And what we look at is we look at how much variability you have in 1 month to the next in terms of your investable funds. Just to give you an example, if you had $100 million at the high time of all your months and $90 million at the low time, we would know that we'd need $10 million in liquidity for when those funds drop from 100 to 90. So that kind of defines how much liquidity we need. And then we add a little bit of a contingency to that to make sure that we've always got the appropriate amount of liquidity. So your funds drop about $40 million between the high and the low. So we want to make sure we always have around $40 million set up in the liquidity balance, and that's kind of our target level. Right now you have $60 million. So you probably have too much liquidity, and so we're going to work to try to balance that out and probably add more funds to the core as we have been doing here in the last month or so. So that's the process that we come through to try to optimize the amount of money that you would have in the core amount versus the liquidity amount. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? Next slide, please. So this is really interesting here. We last fiscal year we had,
What's the difference in the yield between the liquidity accounts and the core accounts? What's your average?
your core right now is yielding 91 basis points, and your liquidity is in the 40s.
Okay.
And your liquidity is exceptionally high because you've got that contractual relationship
Right.
with Pinnacle. The LGIP right now is yielding 8 or 9 1 or 2 basis points here. And so if you had, if you didn't have anything invested in a longer term portfolio, you'd be earning 2 basis points versus 91 basis points. So a significant difference. And particularly over long periods of time. We've looked at 10-year and 15 and 20-year studies, and over long horizons, it makes a significant amount of difference. If there's a truism in investments, the more risk you take over long horizons, the more reward you get. And fixed income, even with Treasury securities, risk is quantified as volatility. And so the longer you go out on the yield curve, the more volatility you have
Sure.
in terms of how those changes. So that's deemed to be risk. If you can go out and buy a 10-year bond and hold it over a 10-year time period, you will typically outperform what cash will give you, Treasury bills would give you over that same time period, because you're willing to take that volatility out there. In order to take that volatility, you have to make sure that you are able to solve for liquidity. And so that's our number one priority, solve for liquidity, and then take the funds and go out further. State statute here limits you guys to 4 years. Right now, we're running the portfolio with kind of a maximum maturity around 3 years. But we're going to be talking about creating some strategies where maybe we can extend that maturity out a little bit, use up that full amount of state statute, and capture some of those higher yields, particularly as rates have now started to rise that exist out in that between that 3 and 4 year area. And so those are the kind of strategies that we'll employ as time goes on. So interest earnings here in fiscal 2020 was $3,681,000 on balances of $172 million. And this year, in fiscal year 2021, the earnings were $2.4 million, or like $1.2 million less, on almost exactly the same average balance. So you can see that the earnings yield in the previous fiscal year in 2020 was 2.13, while the earnings yield in the fiscal 2021 was 1.45. So we had a decline of about 70 5 basis points or so in earnings yield, and that created a decline in interest earnings of about $1.2 million. We expect that earnings yield to most likely decline again in fiscal year 2022 through the next June. As we go through this cycle, and yields have started to rise here in the last couple of months, we're hoping to see a turn in that at some point in time, probably over the next 12 months, and we'll start to see this earnings yield rise once again. Particularly if we adjust some of the maturities to a little bit longer, we should be able to take some of those earnings now that are yielding 40 basis points and convert them into earnings that are yielding 50 basis points out in the 3 to 4 year area. Okay, next slide. We perform, as part of our services, a compliance review and create a compliance report to make sure that everything that you own in your portfolio is compliant to your policy and to state statute. And we run this daily, and this is a printout of that. This is a compliance report here for your assets, for each investment you have in certain assets, and it shows the policy limit on the left-hand column, and then the actual percentage that's invested in the middle column there. And then the far right-hand column is simply whether or not it's compliant or not, and you can see that everything is compliant as far as the type of assets that you're invested in. You also have policy, next slide please. You also have policy rules governing how long you can invest and how much money needs to be held under 30 days, under 2 years, and under 4 years. The policy limit for investments under 30 days is 10% of the portfolio, and you actually have 31% of the portfolio under 30 days. So once again, probably a perception that maybe as of June 30th, we were running a little too heavy in liquidity. Under 2 years, the policy requires 50%, a minimum of 50% of the portfolio to be invested with a 2 year or less maturity, and you have 82%. So highly liquid, highly conservative structure here, definitely meeting all the requirements for the policy in terms of make sure you have enough
So
liquidity.
is there any thought or guidance as we get with more uncertainty that we change our policies to increase our liquidity requirements under policy, even though we are way above those? Should we look at re-looking at our, I mean, just, are you comfortable with where we are on our policies?
Well, I'll jump in here just for a moment, because part of the conversations that our staff has with GPA is what are our liquidity needs. And something that my colleague Michael Walters-Young showed to the board on Tuesday night in an update of our capital improvement program was that we're looking at putting even more cash toward our CIP rather than debt. That mixture, he had showed a pie chart of that we are in a position to put more cash, to change that mixture a little bit more toward cash rather than debt. And so we are constantly getting the information from our project managers and engineers on where they are with the cash funded projects, and then feeding that information over to GPA. And that's something that, so many of the projects that Michael was summarizing the other night, they're not yet into construction. They're in the right-of-way design. And once they go into construction, those cash funded projects, the need for the liquidity in the short term will be there. So that is something that we have done a little bit more of moving into the core here in the fall. We did look at this at the end of the year, and this fall have been making some changes, but we are still very closely looking at what our needs are on those capital projects, because we certainly have a good handle on our operating expenses and our debt payments, our debt service payments, but it's understanding those liquidity needs on the cash funded capital that's something that I grapple with.
And have we looked at the policies with regard to debt and pay-as-you-go in our capital projects and where we want to be there? And I think you said the other night we're like 50-50, if I remember correctly.
We're at 65-35?
So the overarching goal has been
That's
50/50.
That's what, okay,
as
that was
sort
the
of as
goal.
a
That was the
minimum.
goal, okay. I knew I
And-
remembered that somewhere.
There was a side conversation on Tuesday night. Someone asked me, why 50/50? And I kind of gave the answer of because it sounded just about right that you didn't want to do more. So if we go back to 2017, it was looking more 55 debt, 45 cash. And when we got to 2019, it was 55 cash, 45 debt. Now the presentation that I gave on Tuesday night was 64 cash, 36 debt. So, but again, to Christine's point, you know, unfortunately, it's taking longer to complete projects for all of the reasons that we talked about on Tuesday night and that were echoed earlier regarding supply chains and getting materials and getting qualified labor and what have you. We haven't per se looked at the policy and really made that, changed the debt management policy or changed investment policies per se as a result of that. That's certainly something that we can examine if
Yeah, I
need
don't
be.
know. I'm going back to my TDOT days, but I ran the Department of Transportation for Tennessee for 8 years. And we, were whether it's right or wrong, we were the only state in the nation that had no transportation debt. And it worked really, really well once we got there. I mean, in other words, so we were able to continue our volume in a sustainable way and do it. And I'd like to think that I'm debt adverse, maybe professionally, but not privately. I'm not sure. But I don't know. I just think that's something we should continue to look at and look at the benefits of debt and cash and where we stand. And I mean, I know when you have debt, you can just build a whole lot. As I told you just a minute ago, a friend of mine used to say, you know, there's nothing too good for the fully leveraged. And so, I mean, we can afford to go and build as many roads as we want to build if we want to borrow that money, because we got plenty of debt capacity, but you got to pay it back sometime. And so I don't think that's anything that's urgent. I just think that's something, and I think you do, but it's just something that we should continue to monitor and look at our policies, how that's structured, and based upon, you know, the volatility of the market one way or the other. So I just throw that out.
I will note that we, you know, one of the conversations and certainly listening to your guidance and reactions to Tuesday night was the desire to dig a little bit deeper into that presentation.
You sure that's
and-
what we
and the
talked
model.
about Tuesday night? I'm not sure. It's kind of vague in my mind.
There was a lot we talked about Tuesday night, but well, on this particular item, you know, one of the things that we did do before presenting was we ran the debt policy ratios to ensure that even at that high peak of proposed of having $25 million a year in debt service compared to 15.5 of where we are today, or 15.7, I believe, would we, with reasonable increases in full value of the community and general fund revenues and general expenses. When I say general fund, it's all funds but the enterprise fund of water management. We stayed within all of our policy ratios. They increased slightly because the proposal was to fund or borrow an additional $115 million. But that also gets to the philosophical reason of why you borrow versus cash. And the simple reality is, of course, that you can do more quicker if you borrow.
Right.
And there is an equity argument to using debt to finance public projects, because the people who use the asset will end up paying for it, as opposed to the people that paid cash, arguably the people of yesterday, are paying for tomorrow's asset. And that's true about roads, fire trucks, fire stations, schools, etc. With all respect to how the state of Tennessee has done it and does it brilliantly from a financial perspective, that does not borrow for roads.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. We've had lots of those philosophical discussions, so.
Michael, if this is just, so if we were to do City Hall on a cash basis without borrowing, you know, I was just sitting there thinking, we might have a bubbly fountain or two less.
And less artwork.
And less artwork, and less museums, and less petting zoos or whatever else we were presented with the other night. I kind of like that. I mean, I don't know why I would. I mean, you know, and I'm not a proponent of not having a bubbly fountain someplace. But that's interesting. I like that.
Well, I'm sitting between the two most conservative financial aldermen that there is, and so I'm not surprised by it.
And Alderman Barnhill, may I make one other comment about our liquidity, that I think it is important for Alderman Schroer's point that about, and it relates to capital projects, we have begun our last year of the wastewater treatment plant expansion and upgrade, and that project has really pushed on our liquidity needs. Of the $153 million, $119.5 million are borrowed from the state of Tennessee through the state revolving loan program, which is it's a reimbursement-based loan rather than receiving money up front and us paying it all, pulling out of a bond account and paying down. And so we've had to float, and in some cases, $6 million monthly bills, we've had to float for a period of 60 to even a little bit longer back when some of the state offices were shut down. So when that project is completed, when we finish, we have one more state revolving
Oh, you'll have lots
fund
of
loan to go
cash.
through, we won't have to be pushing on our liquidity the way, there have been some times that we have been floating $12 million in the time frame between paying bills and receiving monies back from the state. So that has, for about the last 2 years, and for the next 8 or 9 months, we'll be pulling on our liquidity, and then our cash, that will give us more room to perhaps, push down a little bit on our liquidity needs, depending on capital projects in the future. But the SRF part of the wastewater plant has been a good way to borrow. It's been very attractive interest rates, but it has pushed on our liquidity. We're thankful that we can be able to do that.
Well, and that's an enterprise fund too, so.
But it is certainly the cash, the numbers that you're seeing here do include the enterprise fund and non-pension investments that we are managing.
Well, I always go back, John, to the most interesting one, where we financed the police station and never paid anything on the principal for the first,
That's right.
15, 20 years of the bond issue. I mean, we didn't, I mean, I guess we did a balloon note or whatever you want to call it for layman's terms, but we never paid anything.
That's because we couldn't afford to build it when we built it,
Exactly.
That's exactly right.
which is one reason I didn't want to build it back then.
And the three of us weren't on there when they did that either.
Exactly. You're exactly right.
I
But
will.
you are paying on that building now,
We are
sir,
paying on
so-
that building now at a lower interest rate.
And
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
we have helped ourselves.
I might add that one other limitation for changing your policy in terms of maturities and your liquidity requirements is state statute. State statute limits your investments to 4 years, and so having 50% 2 years and under kind of aligns with the 4-year portfolio, where you'd have 25% of the portfolio invested in each year. So these approximate pretty closely to what is appropriate for state statute. Next slide, please. So throughout the year, as I said, a great deal of uncertainty, so we've kept our core duration. Your portfolio, your core portfolio is, we measure against a benchmark, a 0 to 3 year Treasury benchmark, which has a defined duration and defined metrics. And so we try to manage your portfolio to match up against that benchmark portfolio, because it'll provide the historical returns and volatility that we expect. And so it's all about managing to expectations. And so we feel that if we keep the core portfolio close to the core benchmark, you'll get returns that are very close to that benchmark, which over long horizons will outperform cash on a conservative basis. So that's kind of the purpose of that. When we get a more clear direction, we will maybe make suggestions to change our duration to maybe be slightly longer than the benchmark or slightly shorter than the benchmark. Similar to 2015, when the Fed started raising rates, we kept our benchmark shorter because we were in a rate rising environment for the next 18 months, and you could tell that rates were going to continue to rise. Right now, we're just in that transitional period where we really don't know when rates will start rising, But when they do start rising, and they start rising on more of a consistent pace that the Fed is used to, we'll probably at that time keep our duration shorter than the benchmark, and hopefully over a long horizon we'll outperform that benchmark or perform very closely to it. As I mentioned, agency spreads are non-existent to Treasuries, so we're backing away from agencies until those spreads reappear and show value again. The book yield in the portfolio, on the total portfolio, decreased from a 109 to a 91 basis points. And right now you have over $700,000 in unrealized gains in the portfolio, which we view as added liquidity, because you can sell securities currently and take gains, as opposed if interest rates were rising, you would be forced to sell securities and take a loss if you needed the liquidity. So whenever you have a lot of unrealized gains in the portfolio, it kind of gives you an added liquidity cushion on top of the liquidity that you already have, because the portfolio is more sellable. The core portfolio duration decreased over the quarter from a 146 to 139. The benchmark is 1.47. These are all in years, so they're all basically, what it's basically saying is that we're keeping the average duration or the average maturity of your portfolio, your core portfolio, close to the benchmark right now. The total return of the core portfolio, if you take in changes in yields, was really close to zero, because yields have risen, so the prices of the securities that you have in some of the portfolio have declined over this time period, but it was still better than the benchmark, which had a loss of minus 2 basis points over the last fiscal year. So now I want to kind of flip forward from June 30 to September 30 and just quickly review the portfolio again, just to bring you up to date to where we're at. If you could go one more slide. You now have $62 million in cash and $135 million in investments, and the book yield is now at 77 basis points versus that 91 basis points, so it's declined a little bit more, and that's why I believe that you should expect lower interest earnings throughout the rest of fiscal year 2022. The market yield has risen up to 23 basis points from 19 basis points at the end of the fiscal year, and your effective duration of the portfolio is still just right at 0.9 years, or just a little bit under a year. The balance between core liquidity and your bond investments are all about the same as existed on September 30th. You have, today you have 35% of the portfolio invested in agencies, 31% of the portfolio invested in treasuries, 21% is invested in the LGIP or pooled funds, while 11.5% is invested in bank deposits, with just a fractional amount left over for money market funds and zero in cash. So pretty equally invested between agencies, treasuries, and then liquidity between pooled funds and bank deposits. Next slide, please. So this is just the ratings on the securities. Like I said, for all intents and purposes, everything you have is rated AAA. Standard & Poor's likes to, they're holding to their AA plus rating on treasuries and agencies. You have NA there, you've got a sizable amount that's not rated, which is your LGIP and your pool, your bank deposits.
Dave, if I can, real quick, and this is a fun group, so I think it's a good point to interject this, that in 2011, the S&P downgraded the U.S. for profligate spending and poor fiscal management, and I can't believe that they've all been so silent in the last 18 months as we've added $5.3 trillion in debt and kicking the can on the debt ceiling down the road, but it's remarkable that they haven't come back to the table.
So
and then when we can't pay our interest payments, it'll really be good for them.
yeah.
We'll be looking for another chip then.
Let's see if we can go one more slide. Okay, so this is, we do a return analysis taking market value changes into context here. Over the trailing 3 years, the portfolio has earned a 220 on a net basis and a 222 on gross of fees basis, while the benchmark earned 227. So we've kept right close to your benchmark returns. Over 5 years, we're slightly ahead. Over 3 years, we're slightly behind. And over the last 12 months, we're ahead both in net of fees and gross of fees relative to the benchmark, albeit with a very small return of 13 basis points versus the benchmark return of 5 basis points. So as you can see, in the last quarter and fiscal year to date, the returns are close to zero once you take in the interest income or the change in market pricing. Yet the portfolio is continuing to yield that 77 basis points. So the book yield of the portfolio is still producing a 77 basis point return, but as interest rates rise, that will depress the price of the securities. Although if you don't sell securities, you don't recognize those losses. So it provides a guidance to how the assets are performing overall, yet your book yield is what is actually providing your interest earnings. Next slide, please. So this is the core portfolio and how we have the core portfolio structured to maturities. And you can see we got about a third of the portfolio invested between 2 years and 3 years, and 25% of the portfolio invested between 1 year and 2 years. So that's 57% of the portfolio. That means we've got 43% of the portfolio less than a year in the core portfolio. So still fairly heavily weighted to the front end. And this might be where we can have an opportunity to get some of those funds invested out in that 3 to 4 year bucket if we do look to move the maturity structure out a little bit longer to take advantage of the yield curve, the current yield curve, and also how state statute allows for your investments. Any questions on that or anything? Next slide, please. So this is the total portfolio, and this includes your liquidity, your pooled funds, and your bank deposits. And you can see that the chart changes to where most of the funds are under 90 days, which effectively in cash. So right now this shows that you've got about 40% in liquidity right now, invested in very short securities. Next slide, please. And this shows you, this slide here is your liquidity portfolio as of September 30th. You had $61 million in liquidity at that time, yielding 33 basis points. So once again, excellent return relative to any other entity we work with in terms of liquidity returns. Your average liquidity returns that we see are usually anywhere from the 7 to 8 basis points, with the state of Oregon being the exception, because in the state of Oregon, public entities have the ability to invest a certain portion of their liquidity into a pooled fund that can go out to 3 years and can invest in all types of securities. Garrett managed that pooled fund for 10 years, and so he's well versed in what the advantages that they had at that level that public entities couldn't do on the individual level. But the public entities had a huge advantage investing in that because they could invest in that fund with NAV stuck at $1. So they never had any possibility of taking a loss, even though they were investing basically in 3-year securities. And so the state of Oregon is, to my knowledge, probably the only state in the nation that does provide that to their entities. And it's Utah is the other one, but so it's a significant advantage. But outside of that, your liquidity investment returns are exceptional at 33 basis points. And just to give you an idea, the state of Oregon, who goes out to 3 years right now, they just dropped their rate to 45 basis points. So you guys are pretty close to what they're getting investing in foreign entities and single A credits out in the 3-year space versus your investments currently. Next slide, please. This just breaks down between your liquidity and your bank deposits and your pooled fund. So it just shows the balances and what you're earning in each. And the book yield in your liquidity for the LGIP is 2 basis points, while Pinnacle Bank is the one that's providing 1 basis point or 1% right now. So until June of next year, you're going to enjoy a very good rate there. Next slide, please. This is an overview of your bond fund investments, of which you've only got about $5 million left in that investment as of September 30th. The yield right now is a very attractive 148. The effective duration of the existing portfolio is less than a quarter of a year, so this is going to mature over the next 6 months. So strategy, last slide, strategy for next year is, once again, we want to really work hard on optimizing the amount of funds that should exist in liquidity versus the core amount, because that's the key really for optimizing the overall return of the portfolio, is making sure you have that appropriate balance in there and that we're keeping as much money invested into the core as possible while meeting all of our liquidity needs. We think over the next 12 months, it's going to be characterized by a tremendous amount of uncertainty, unlike we've had over the last 12 months, or very similar to the last 12 months. So we're going to continue to play our duration targets very close to the benchmark until we get direction that the Fed has entered into a interest rate rising cycle, which is probably most likely won't happen until we meet again next fall. So we'll continue to try to optimize the balance between liquidity and core, and try to make those investments the best we can. Bond proceeds will just continue to be managed, meeting the liquidity requirements of the project. And this bond proceed of 2019 is nearing the end of its life, and it will be done in the next probably 3 or 4 months. The last segment here is just on portfolio holdings. I'm not going to go through it. I'll just leave that as a reference to you as far as the securities that are in the portfolio, and just open it up for any questions that you may have right now.
So my only question, is this a throwback to Russ, that they're from Oregon? Nobody wants to answer that question?
I'll take a jump though. We have gone through a procurement process since I arrived, and we're very pleased that we retained GPA with us. They've been a pleasure to work with, and they've handled the change very well as I came in. So it's they provide very effective service, and they are always responsive. And I learned today when I met Garrett, I always knew that he responded to me early in the morning, even though I may send a message. I don't expect people in different time zones to necessarily be awake, but I found out this morning why he responds back to me is that even though he lives in the West, he works on Eastern time. So I did learn that today.
That happens a lot from West Coast people.
I hear from him in the morning. So, but
So it's past your bedtime now. It's time for dinner anyway, that's for sure.
Well, it's ironic, I have 2 small children, and most adults, they get to put their children down to bed and then enjoy some time themselves, and I get tucked in right after my 6-year-old.
Yeah. Isn't it time to go to bed? Isn't it time to go to bed? Well, thank you all. Very informative.
Thank you.
And obviously, you're doing a great job, and I was just making a joke about the Russ thing. You knew that. And it's interesting to go through these things. I was on the board of the National Association of Transportation Officials, and they have a huge portfolio, and I really hadn't done much of that before, and it's interesting to have an integral part of that and listen to different investment advisors and managers and what they say. But appreciate what you do and for the city and all you all involved. I think the city's in great shape, so it should be AAA rated credit.
Thank you.
across the board.
Appreciate it.
So.
Have you enjoyed our meeting?
Absolutely.
Well, listen, you can't come. Here's the deal. We owed you at least 45 minutes because you can't fly all the way from Oregon for a 30-second presentation.
Exactly.
That's kind of a wasted. It's like, really? We came all the way for that? So we had to really drag it out just to make it worth your while.
Well, we appreciate your efforts there. Thank you.
Don't fly back southwest.
No.
You can't. You can't.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Well, that's another one of those employment issues. They've got pilots aren't gonna fly and other issues and, oh well.
Michael or Michael? Either one of you got any questions? Ann? All right, well, let's close item 3 and go to item 4 then, which is the monthly report for October 2021. Mike, I'm gonna let you take that and run with it.
Good afternoon. I would like to, with monthly reports, cover 5 highlights. And for each report, there is positive news. Number 1, for local sales tax on Schedule 1, July is the 4th month that we've had over $4 million, beginning in April, which of course was the first month that we received the additional, or at least the
Yeah.
city's portion of the additional 0.5% increase. The amount for July 2021 was $4.5 million. Last July was $3 million. So in essence, the increase was $1.5 million, or almost 50% over the previous July. In development fees, which include building
Mike,
permits.
before you go forward.
Yeah,
Not all of that. How much is that is attributable then to the half the percent that we got? Am I making it question?
No, I understand what
Yeah.
you're talking about.
We were averaging roughly $700,000 a month from the 0.5%.
From the half. So,
Before it all got folded back into one.
so
coming back
basically
to
then
us
the
in April.
1.47, half of that is the half of the half.
exactly.
Correct,
So we're
So we are doing better than we
We
were
are
a
doing
year
even
ago.
better
That's
than,
right.
yeah.
correct.
Without that even,
significantly better.
significantly better, you're right.
On the second item, which is development fees, which includes building permits, road impact fees, and city facilities tax and county facilities tax, the first 2 months have exceeded collections for the first 2 months of the last year. And of course, these revenues are dependent on timing and the type of development. Number 3, with more travel, we have seen an increase in both fuel taxes and also hotel motel taxes. For fuel taxes with July of 2021, there have now been 4 straight months of at least $240,000. Budget anticipated around $207,000 per month. And with more travel, the July 2021 amount is above last July of 6.7%. For hotel motel taxes,
How much of that is, we're still in the increasing amount under the Improve Act. I mean, it's still, prices are, I mean, taxes are going up that way. How much can you see a difference in that? Have you looked at what impact that's had or at all? It's not really important, but it's
Yeah.
probably insignificant.
Normally, I would defer to you to explain when the Improve Act went and when it didn't, Commissioner.
Goes over, I can't remember, more like 7, 8 years.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly where we are in sequence. There's,
I just would,
I would
don't
say
even
re-
ask,
I would
go
say
on.
regarding
Stop,
the
quit.
gasoline tax, it is, again, our entire worldview was based on the assumption that you would see tangible economic effects as a result of the pandemic. And in the tourist-related area, which
Yeah.
Mike is about to say,
Absolutely.
we absolutely did.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
In virtually all others,
we did.
meh. So this is one of those areas where certainly the Improve Act made a difference in terms of overall collections, but it's relatively small overall.
Well, you know, according to those who voted against it, it was going to destroy our entire economy. I just thought that, you know, I'd mention it. Okay, never mind.
Okay. Point.
as Michael mentioned, for the hotel motel taxes, July 2021 is almost 60% higher than July of 2020.
So
It was
where would
there.
have been, yeah,
There.
before the pandemic, how much
It's gotta
have we
be. Didn't it
recovered?
have that on there?
I don't have it here on the executive summary, but it is on the monthly
I
report.
was gonna
Okay,
say, it's
I didn't-
there, it's there.
Okay, I'll look at that. Never mind.
Because that's why on the monthly reports, like.
I need to
we'd
hurry, I'm
like
gonna be
to,
cut
in
off
essence,
pretty
keep
soon
that
from now on, but I'll
information.
see it.
So back in 2019, there was $4 million total for the year. In 2020, it went down to 3.1 million. 2021, 2.5 million.
Yeah,
So in essence, it's one that it's recovering. And then I guess what we're.
So on an annualized basis, what would the last 4 months show? Do you
Well, I
know?
guess what'll happen is if we're at 400,000, it'll be essentially trying to extrapolate that to be what the
Yeah,
entire year
okay.
would be.
Just
And I know in budget, you had put 2.4 million.
Right. So
Yeah.
our assumption on tourism that it would take fully 3 years to come back, and that's primarily related to the fact that festivals have started to return, Reed Pilgrimage, sporting tournaments have started to return, those sorts of things. But the big concern we have with Hotel Motel is the big concern I think everyone in the tourist industry has, and that is how much business travel will come back during the week. And there's still a lot of leading indicators that say that is still lagging.
Yeah.
You talk to local hoteliers, and they're going to say, that the amount of people that are staying at the Marriott or at any of our 30-plus hotels in Franklin continues to be less during the week than pre-pandemic. So a $400,000 amount, though, certainly for the month of July, is a very large
Very
amount.
good, yeah.
Historic. So.
And then also related to that is as conferences do begin to return to in-person events, the conference center in August had a profit, which is the city's half share. It was $52,000.
That's
a
good.
profit,
A
and
profit,
compared
yeah.
to so
Oh.
much that we've been going through.
Absolutely,
on
yeah,
that.
because last August, we had a loss of 14,000. And the last item I had, last highlight, is for grants, we would like to provide the committee an update on the American Rescue Plan Act at your combined November-December meeting on December 2nd. For the American Rescue Plan Act, the city received $4.6 million in May of 2021, and will anticipate $4.6 million additional in May of 2022. And this meeting, December 2nd, will also be the meeting that the audit presentation will be given by Crossland CPAs.
Yeah, right.
So basically, we're announcing no November meeting.
It's
Enroll-
it's a combined meeting on
enroll-
December 2nd of
enrolls into
November
December
through
the
and
2nd.
December.
You plan on being here?
Oh, yeah, I'll be right at the front row.
Now, the front
No,
row-
I'm going to be
no,
those,
the front row's roped off.
I'm going to be those people that Dana was talking about the other night that was actually watching it on TV, even though they were running for all of us. Yeah. I promise you I'll be watching it on TV.
Michael, anything else? Christine, anything else?
I guess Mike went ahead and announced, we do have one more meeting for this calendar year for Thursday, December the 2nd. And the last thought that I have, it's not about the agenda, but on behalf of the team that I support and represent that works with this committee, we do want to thank Alderman Schroer and Alderman Speedy for their service, specifically to this committee. It's something that we don't take lightly, the support of having our Budget and Finance Committee and all the aldermen who serve in this capacity. So we do thank you for sitting through what you sit through, but we also, even more so, we thank you for the support and the guidance and the feedback. So we do want to wish Alderman Schroer and Alderman Speedy, and certainly we always think about Alderman Bransford, served this committee for a long time, and so she remains in our thoughts as well. So thank you all very much, and we're honored that Alderman Barnhill and Alderman Peterson will, if they, working with the mayor, decide to stay on this committee, will hopefully be back with us. So thank you very much.
I'm just going to say I've enjoyed this a lot because I love the finance part. A whole lot better than the sister cities. I'm sorry, did I say that?
Suits you, doesn't it?
Yeah, this suits, well, yeah, And Ken actually apologized for that one when he said, I'm gonna put you on finance and sister cities.
So,
Well, and transportation too. We see, those two were just fine, but I
if,
hope none of them are watching this. I missed a meeting this morning.
I would suspect there's 80,000 people viewing this thing right now.
I bet so.
Either that or on the rerun.
Well, you know, and I was just sitting there thinking, going through all this, is that this is where a prospective alderman needs to be sitting right now. Because they're coming in, they don't have a clue about the financial side of this city, and it's vital to what we do. And fortunately, we have a great staff that takes care of us, and a lot of us can be not in the know about this, but you do need the guidance and the support from those that go through this committee. So anyway.
Any other business to come before the committee? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. We are adjourned.
Hey, that might be my last so moved.